ChessFest Academy number 7, where we start to learn about the pawn. First off, congratulations on making it this far. Stick with it and you will get better and better. Now the pawn, some people think the pawn is the simplest piece. I think it's horribly complicated. Pawns are pretty complicated. That's why I saved them for last. Think about it. The king, one square in any direction. The rook, straight line, side to side, front and back. Bishops move diagonally. The queen, just combine the moves of the rook and the bishop. It can move like either a rook or a bishop. And knights are a little tricky to see what they're doing, but we can understand 1, 2, and over. Now the pawns, they move like this, except for when, and then there's except for that. Pawns get pretty tricky. So we're actually going to spend 2 lessons on the pawn. Today we'll just do their basic move and attack. And then next time in lesson 8, we'll look at some of the tricky stuff with pawns. So your white pawns, you have 8 of them. And your black pawns, you have 8 of those. Make sure you have that board oriented correctly before we even start. You have white on right. I was actually reading current issue of a magazine, and they had a picture of a chessboard in that magazine, and they had the board turned the wrong way. My son was watching a video from the History Channel last night, and the Mongols were playing chess, and they had the board turned the wrong way. And both of those, people don't understand. White on right. And the white pawns you see go on the 2nd rank. You have 8 white pawns going all the way across the 2nd rank. Black pawns, of course, will go across the 7th rank. So we have these, you probably guessed were originally foot soldiers. That's what the word pawn means. These are your foot soldiers. And an easy thing to remember about the pawn is a foot soldier is sent out there to just clear some space in a war, to just drive things forward. And that's what the pawn does in chess, is just really pushes forward, advances and attacks. And so that's why pawns never move backwards, because that would be retreating. And in this army, there is no retreat. Forward only for pawns. Now let's start with white. When we write pawns, you're going to find something interesting. Your first move, I'll give you white, your move is e4. Notice I did not say pawn e4, and when we write it, we don't write p e4. We just leave out the name of the piece. So whenever you see a chess move written and it doesn't say which piece to move, it's a pawn. Or if I just say the name of a square for a move, it's a pawn. Unless we say it's one of the major pieces. So white, your first move there is e4. Notice, how can pawns move? They can move forward. And when he's starting off from this starting row, he can move 2 squares. Black, let's answer similarly. Go ahead and do e5. So you're taking that pawn who's on the e file, and he's moving out to e5. Notice if I say e4, you know it's a pawn, and no other pawn can get there, because the pawns are only going to move. They move only straight. Now notice these 2 pawns here on the e file. The white pawn on e4, the black pawn on e5. Picture these soldiers. They have a shield out in front of them. And then they have their sword out to the side, and either side. But they want to keep that shield out in front as they charge across this field of battle. That's why these 2 pawns are not attacking each other. We can just think of them, they're bumping shields. They're sitting there bumping shields. Neither of them can move at all. And they can't attack each other, because they have their shields out in front, and they're just bumping shields up against each other. Their swords that they'll attack with are out on the side. They can switch, but the shield stays in front to protect themselves. So these soldiers have a shield out in front. That's why these 2 pawns are not attacking each other. They're just bumping shields there on the e file. Let's say, though, white, go ahead and move d3. So now we've learned something. On its first time out, the first time you move any of these pawns, it can move 2 squares, as we did on white's and black's first move, or you have the choice. You can do either. You can move 1 square if you wish. So you can move it out 2 squares as we did with e4. And now white's second move, he's doing d3 and just taking that pawn out 1 square. We'll come back to that in a second, okay? Now let's go to black's second move. Go ahead, black, find your d file and take your d pawn because we're moving d5. Notice again, I don't tell you which piece, I just say d5 is your move. You know it's a pawn because I didn't tell you which piece. Now, look at black's d pawn there that we just moved. He's now attacking white's e pawn. Because let's go back to black's d pawn there on d5. He has that shield out in front and his sword is coming out at an angle. So pawns move forward but attack diagonally in either direction. Now they can't move diagonally because you wouldn't send a soldier just careening off diagonally if there's nothing there to attack. A pawn will only go diagonally if there's something there to attack and capture. So black's d pawn now is threatening to take white's pawn on e4. So move forward, attack diagonally. Now white, you have a choice. You can take black's d pawn there on d5 because you, look at white's e4 pawn, he has that shield out in front bumping up against the other e pawn, black's e5 pawn, and his sword is coming out diagonally too, to either side, including diagonally to black's d5 pawn. So with that sword coming out diagonally, white, you can go ahead and take black's d pawn. Now here is one of the most important lessons a beginning player needs to learn, which is white, you could capture that black d pawn, but you don't have to. Because look at your e pawn, he's protected right now, isn't he, by your d pawn. You see these, in fact, if you look at white's pawns here, he has this diagonal set up across C, D, and E, the C, D, and E files, and all those pawns are attacking diagonally, protecting each other, saying, hey, if you take my friend here, I'll take you back. So capture for capture is going to end up being a swap. So white might just go ahead and leave that e pawn there and do something else. Let's say he wants to, we'll come back to this too, fianchetto his bishop over on the king side. White, I'm going to ask you to ignore the capture that you could take there. Just ignore it for now. You have more important things to do. You don't always have to take every capture, only if it actually helps your game. Let's do instead b3. So white, b3. And again, we could have moved him out to b4, but we have a reason we're going to take him just to b3. Now black, it's your turn. You have that capture you can take. And black, by gum, you want to go for it. You know, black, you're not going to come out ahead. It's going to be an even swap. So let's go ahead and do that swap. So black, the way we write this is dx e4. That means the pawn on D will capture on the square e4. dx e4, make sure you're doing it with one hand, piece on the side, stays untouched for the rest of the game. Thank you. Now white, it's back to you. You wouldn't have to, but you'd like to even things up here. You see how your D pawn, shield out in front, attacking diagonally, is attacking that pawn that black threw out to e4 there. By the way, black, right now you have doubled pawns, and doubled pawns are generally a bad thing, because the one who's stuck behind, you really can't move him, can you? You'd have to move the one in front and then move him, and 2 moves can be an eternity at the beginning of a chess game. It can cost you a lot. So black, you don't really mind this swap. It's going to open up things a little bit for you here. So white, go ahead, D, your D pawn, take your D pawn, and your D pawn will capture on e4, dx e4. And isn't it funny that we wrote those 2 moves the same way? dx e4, dx e4. Black and white's move were both written the same way, a D pawn capturing on e4. Notice again our 2 pawns here on the e file, the black and white pawns are bumping shields. There's no attack, there's no capture, there's no threat there. White, notice you have your pawns in 3 kind of islands, and black you as well. You have your, both of you have your ABC pawns in a little island connected together. your FGH pawns in a little island connected together, and both of you have your E pawns isolated out there. Connected pawns are generally going to be a little bit stronger than an isolated pawn, but the isolated pawn in this case is helping you out. We'll come back to all that when we do some more strategy. Let's move our pawns all back, and we'll walk through one quick little exercise together, and then you can practice moving your pawns yourself. Okay, let's start again with white, E4. So it's the pawn on the E file, moving up 2 squares to E4. Black, E5. Right, that E pawn moving up to the 5th rank. White, let's again do D3. And black again answer with D5. Notice we're playing through the same moves here and get a sense for how pawns move. White, B3. That's the B pawn moving up to the 3rd rank. Black, you'd like to do the pawn exchange here. So DXE4. And white, you're going to do the same thing. Your D pawn capturing on E4, DXE4. And now it is black's move. Black, why don't you do G6? That's right, your G pawn moving out just 1 square. Remember, on that first time you move that pawn, you have the choice of 1 or 2 squares. White, let's do H4. Notice so far we've mostly moved our pawns in the center. This is the first time we've moved one out on the side, and that's usually the way it works in the real game as well. So white has moved H4. Black, go ahead and answer with C5. Black, take your C pawn and move them out to the 5th rank, C5. White, G3. See, he can move 1 or 2 squares. Black, why don't you do F5? Black, F5. And now we have a capture on the board. But take a look at it. If white captures black's F pawn, what do you think black will do? That's right, his G pawn is poised to capture back, so it will be a swap. So let's do that. White, go ahead. EXF5, the E pawn captures on F5. And black, you can return the favor with GXF5. White, let's take that H pawn and advance him 1 square to H5. Now notice, after a pawn has moved out its initial move, the first time you move that pawn at any point in the game, you have the choice of moving it 1 or 2 squares. After the first time you move that pawn, it's 1 square after that. So this H pawn could not hop from H4 all the way up to H6. He does not have that option. He can only move 1 square after that initial move. I told you pawns are tricky. So he's on H5. Now black, let's say you want to move your H pawn as well. You only have one choice with him, don't you? You can't move the 2 squares out to H5 because pawns don't capture in a forward direction. They only capture diagonally. There's a shield out in front. So your H pawn, black, your only choice there is what? H6. That's right. He can only move to H6. He can't advance to the occupied square, H5. Pawns don't hop over pieces or anything. And he can't capture the white pawn in H5 because pawns only capture diagonally. All right, white, it is now your turn. You're going to go with F4. So white, F4. So white, you've moved F4. And black, I'm sure you see an opportunity here. And I bet you notice a couple of things about it. That if you capture white's F pawn, he will, in turn, use his G pawn to capture you back, most likely. And that will, well, first your capture will leave you with doubled pawns, which you generally don't want. But you see it's going to be an even exchange, And so you're okay with that. And by the way, pawns count for 1 point each. Remember our point system? Pawns are just 1 point each. So it's just 1 point for each pawn. So black, let's go ahead. EXF4. Take that white pawn. White, you can be a chum and return the favor. GXF4. So you capture back the black pawn. Notice the pawns now on the F file and the H file. All 4 of those pawns, the 2 white and 2 black pawns on the F file and the H file, what can't they do? They can't do anything. They can't move. They can't capture. They will never be able to move or capture. They are just stuck at this point, given the setup we have, the position we have. They are just stuck like that for good because we have no other pieces on the board. All right, now you have a good idea of what to do at pawns. From their initial move, you have the choice of either 1 or 2 squares. They only move forward. After that initial move, they can only move 1 square at a time, and they attack diagonally. Now there are some other tricky things with pawns that might come up if you're practicing with pawns that we're going to cover in lesson 8. So you may want to just leave it there for pawns. Watch lesson 8 before you do any more pawn exercises. As I warned you, pawns are tricky. Well, we will see you next time on ChessFest Academy.